Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our webinar. This is the first webinar of a series of webinars that we'll be having as part of this new enterprise that is the RISE Coalition, which is a new coalition organized by Rights and Security International. And we are establishing this space for civil society organizations around the world to discuss and network and share knowledge about security and national security and human rights. And I don't want to extend myself, so I'll just give the word to our executive director, Sarah St. Vincent, who will speak a little bit opening remarks, and then we'll follow on from there. So Sarah, please.
Sure, my pleasure. And I know we still have some people joining us, and that's fine. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Fernanda mentioned, I am Sarah St. Vincent. I'm the Executive Director of Rights and Security International. And this is the first of many educational and discussion events that we plan to hold for our partners in the RISE Coalition, as well as others. So for organizations that are joining us, we hope you'll also consider joining the RISE Coalition, which is an informal but active group of NGOs that share knowledge and work together to address human rights abuses that governments carry out in the name of national security. Today, digital technology gives governments highly sophisticated and often non-transparent ways to do many of the things they've always done, unfortunately, such as surveilling unpopular groups, trying to predict and shape behaviors, and creating digital dossiers about people who are active in movements that could change the social order. Of course, government uses of advanced information technology can also have benefits, such as when agencies, including intelligence agencies, put large searchable archives of historical records online for the public. However, in the name of national security, many governments have adopted technologies that threaten human rights. For instance, governments have used narratives about combating terrorism and what they regard as extremism, often undefined, to monitor people both within and outside their borders, shut down the internet, and share large troves of private data. The implications for civil society are serious, and there's a pressing need for transparency and accountability among government agencies that deploy surveillance, predictive algorithms, and other tools as part of what they call security programs. Governments should also recognize that respect for human rights promotes people's safety rather than jeopardizing it, which is indeed why we are called Rights and Security. In this webinar, we will look specifically at the case of Latin America. Historically, authoritarian governments in the region often used intelligence agencies to carry out surveillance and censorship. These operations frequently targeted dissident groups, journalists, students, and trade unions, some of them labeled by the government as terrorist organizations sympathetic to communist ideals. The anti-terrorism tactics deployed during the military dictatorships in Latin America resulted in widespread human rights abuses, which were condemned internationally. With democratization and the new constitutional wave in the 1990s, the protection of democracy, free elections, and human rights became central to the legal and political structures in the region. This included respect for privacy rights and freedom of speech. In the last decade, the region has advanced data protection rights, for example. Chile was the first country in the region to adopt a data protection law in 1999, followed by Argentina in 2000 and Uruguay in 2008. Colombia followed in 2012 and Brazil in 2018. And discussions about digital rights are still unfolding. For instance, in 2020, a landmark ruling of the Brazilian Supreme Court recognized data protection as a fundamental autonomous right provided for in the Brazilian constitution. Why is it still relevant to discuss the use of technology in national security in Latin America right now? Well, first, there are exceptions to various data protection laws, some of them quite broad. Second, the election of authoritarian governments in the region has given rise to a wider use of technology to try to influence election outcomes, for example, monitor citizens, and censor civil society, as well as media outlets. We're honored that Justice Barroso and our panelists have joined us today to talk about these important topics, and we look forward to an exciting and very educational discussion. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much for those opening words, opening remarks. I just want to remember everyone that we have a question and answer box. We won't have live questions and answers, but you're welcome to, throughout the event, post your questions that I will compile and then give to the speakers once their part is done. So we are going to start our panel with a keynote from the Honorable Justice Luis Roberto Barroso from the Brazilian Supreme Court. Justice Barroso is a law professor at the Rio de Janeiro State University. He holds an LLM from the Yale Law School, an SJD from the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro. He has postdoctoral studies at Harvard Law School. He's a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a justice at the Brazilian Supreme Court. He's author of several books and articles on constitutional law. So Justice Barroso, I'm happy to, so thank you so much for agreeing to participate. It's an honor to have you here, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Please, you have the space.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and discuss these important subjects. The title of this presentation is Democracy, Populism, and Misinformation. Of course, I'm going to be very brief about democracy. It's a brief chapter. I'll talk a little bit about populism, but I want to focus our discussion on social media, misinformation, and social media control, which I think is one of the main subjects in discussion around the world in what regards democracy and protecting free speech in a democracy, and also protecting democracy from the sort of attacks it's been getting from social media. So just so that we work over the same concepts, the democratic constitutionalism has been the prevailing ideology of the 20th century. It has defeated all the alternatives that presented themselves, like communism, fascism, Nazism, military regimes, and religious fundamentalisms. And when I say constitutional democracy, I am talking about a regime that involves popular sovereignty, free elections, rule of the majority, rule of the law, and respect for fundamental rights. Although democracy has been the prevailing ideology of the 20th century, there is a generalized feeling that something is not going so well around the world at this moment, and the authors have referred to these moment we're living through as democratic recession, democratic backsliding, illiberal democracies, abusive constitutionalism, or autocratic legalism. There are many names to identify these troubles that democracy is going through right now. I won't mention examples right now. We can do this in the discussion, but many people, many authors, and myself, we are trying to figure what's going on, what's happening in the world at this current moment involving democracy. I think there are three phenomena currently underway that they are different concepts, but when they get together, they become very problematic. And we are talking about populism, extremism, and authoritarianism. When these three different things really get together, we obtain as a result something that Madeleine Albright has called the contemporary fascism, which is a strategy of getting to power and exercising power that involves hate speech, misinformation campaigns, conspiracy theories, which manipulate fragments of truth to distort reality. And it involves the creation of a parallel universe that is identified by metaphors like post-truth or alternative facts. So this is the main subject I want to focus here, having spoken very briefly about what I understand democracy is and the dangers that this extremist authoritarian populism represents to the world. And I'll be happy to get into more details on these concepts if the debates leads to that. But my focus here will be the digital revolution, social media, free speech, and content regulation. As I said before, and Sarah mentioned briefly, the whole world is discussing how to deal with this novelties as the technological platforms and social media and more generally. So we are living, as we all know, under the third industrial revolution, which is the technological revolution that has changed the way we live, the way we shop, the way we do research, the way we buy a plane ticket, the way we give talks in the world today. I've given a talk in the interior of Sao Paulo earlier this morning, another one in Brasilia, and now I'm talking to people in London. So I've been in almost ubiquitous. That's what the technological revolution has done to our lives. When I mention digital or technological revolution, I'm talking about the replacement of the analog technology by digital technology. And we are all talking about the massification of personal computers, smart cell phones, and connecting billions of people around the world, the internet. So this is the third industrial revolution. The first one is symbolized by steam, the second by electricity, and this one by the internet. And we're living, so I think in the brave new world of information technology, biotechnology, nanotechnology, quantum computing, Internet of Things, autonomous cars, and algorithms are becoming the most important concept of our times. And how to deal with this is, I think, one of the challenges of the contemporary world. We now have words, Carlos, Sarah, Fernanda, and everyone, that identify utilities that until yesterday we didn't know, but we wouldn't be able to live without them anymore. I made a short list here: Google, Amazon, WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Waze, Spotify, Dropbox, iTunes, Netflix, and for those who are single, we have also Tinder. So these are all new things. I was recalling when I applied for my LLM at Yale back in 1987 in my other life, and we had to go to the post office and send a letter asking for the materials. And then after a few weeks, you would get the materials. And then you fill out the forms, draw up your CV, write your essay, and send it by mail again. And after several months, you would get an answer by mail. And then if you were admitted, you had to rent an apartment by mail. And this past week, someone from my office, from my chambers, a clerk from my chambers, was admitted to an university. She just, did everything online. It took her less than a week, to get everything done. It took me months. So life was more complex and more challenging some time ago. So I think the internet brought many good things that we should celebrate. And one thing that I think we should emphasize here is that access to information and knowledge has become much more democratic, and I want to talk about this a little bit later. But one thing that we need to highlight here is that although we have all this new comforts and promises of longevity, there are some risks that come with the digital revolution, and that's going to be our next topic. First, I want to mention, but we won't be discussing this, artificial intelligence bring many advantages, but many risks, from discrimination to singularity. There are many risks to privacy with the use of DNA, facial recognition, the surveillance society that Sarah mentioned at the beginning, and the amount of information that the technological platforms hold about all of us. And there are many laws that try to protect us from the improper use of this information. So in this scenario of the digital revolution and of the appearance of social media and messaging platforms, we are also dealing with new problems that involve several different kinds of crimes that can be committed online, and also the propagation of hate speech, conspiracy theories, and of special interest for our conversation here, misinformation campaigns, improperly called fake news. And how should democracies deal with this new problem that has appeared? I just want to make a personal note. Some of the ideas I'm going to share now about media, social media, and content control were drawn from my daughter's, Luna Van Brussel Barroso's dissertation on free speech and misinformation and democracy in the digital era. I'm just giving the proper credit here. And as we all know, the internet revolutionized the world of interpersonal and of social communication, and it expanded exponentially access to knowledge, to information, and it has created a new and very important public sphere that we're going to be talking about in a minute. And the emergence of websites, personal blogs, and above all, the social media enabled the access to this public sphere to everyone, and the possibility of disseminating opinions, information, and ideas and facts. The negative consequence is, for good and for bad, we do not have anymore the screening of professional press before these opinions and ideas and information are published. So we are at this moment, as I mentioned, the internet expanded the access to knowledge and information into the public sphere, but we also deal with not only knowledge, but also ignorance, lies, and different crimes. The social media has become, in many parts of the world, in Brazil included, the main source of information for people generally. Facebook has more than 3 billion followers. YouTube has around 2.5 billion followers. And in Brazil, according to a recent survey, 79% is their main source of information WhatsApp. Television comes in second place, responsible for information to 50% of the population. So what happened in the world is that at a first moment when the internet appeared, the main idea was that it should be free, open, and unregulated. And this perception has changed dramatically. And these days we have the perception that we need to have some sort of regulation in different levels involving economic issues like antitrust, like protection of copyrights, a fair taxation system over technological platforms. That's one level. We have the level of privacy, which is also very important. And as mentioned, many countries have approved privacy laws. And we have this very complicated issue to which I want to dedicate this final part of my talk, which is content control, and when the case, platforms liability. I won't have the time to stress here the importance of freedom of expression. So I'm taking for granted that everyone shares this idea of how important it is for democracy. And we are all aware that this content regulation that we're going to talk about has to be very careful when dealing and protecting freedom of expression. But the truth is that the reasons that led the world to support freedom of expression as something very important, the very same foundations of freedom of expression now requires that some regulation of social media be done to protect freedom of expression. And we need to be aware of what kind of contents we want to regulate. And the first observation is it's important to fight what it's called inauthentic behaviors, which involves the use of automated systems like robos, like trolls, or like false profiles that try to amplify artificially fake messages or try to drown out speeches from other groups. We need to deal with illegal content, a series of behaviors involving terrorism, child sexual abuse, incite to crime and violence, hate speech, anti-democratic attacks like we're facing in Brazil, sale of illicit substances. There is an array of behaviors that need to be fought in the internet. And then we reach the final issue, which is disinformation or misinformation. That is something that is haunting democracies and elections and the public debate all over the world. The dispute these days is not more, the dispute these days is for attention of the public. And as all researches show, and unfortunately, false, defamatory, and sensationalist content, which sparks anger and hate, bring much more engagement than a rational discourse. And that gives the platforms the wrong incentives because, as I mentioned, hate and anger bring much more engagement. So we have to find the proper incentives so that we fight also these problems. And as I say that there must be moderation by the platforms themselves to start with, we also need transparency, due process, and fairness. We can discuss a little bit more about this during our debates. This regulation can come from the state. It can be self-regulation, or as many people defend today, myself including, what is called regulated self regulations. We need to talk about liability of platforms. Strict liability, as some people defend, doesn't seem to me proper. In some countries, and it's being discussed in some parts of Europe, liability would start after an extrajudicial notification. The law in Brazil holds technological platforms liable if there is a court order determining the removal of content, and this is not done. So we are dealing with many, many issues that are important for human rights when we talk about social media, freedom of expression, content control, and these duties of the platforms that I just mentioned, with transparency, with due process, and with fairness. So I'm going to end here just with a couple of conclusions, and then I'll be happy to discuss with everyone that's interested. But what I want to say lastly is that the internet has provided access to knowledge, information, and the public sphere to billions of people, and that has changed the course of history. However, the misuse of internet and social media can pose a serious threat to democracy and to fundamental rights. Confronting inauthentic behavior and illegitimate content is inevitable and requires proper regulation. I think there's a consensus on this now. It's essential, however, to act with proportionality and adequate procedures so that pluralism, diversity, and freedom of expression are not compromised. And finally, media education and awareness of people of good faith, who fortunately still constitute a large majority, are decisive measures for the positive and constructive use of the new technologies. So that's what I could say, Fernanda and Sarah, in 21 minutes about democracy, populism, and how democracies must deal with this phenomena that involve social media, access by anyone to the public sphere without the filter of professional press, how we want to preserve freedom of expression in the internet and in social media, but how we need to fight some kinds of content because they're criminal or because they are destructive to democracy, and what duties the platforms should have, and how we want to regulate content proportionally in the proper measure. So I think these are some initial thoughts for our conversation on democracy, social media, and disinformation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Justice, very much for your very interesting words. I'm going to open the floor to questions, maybe starting with our panelists. Someone told me that for some reason the Q&A button is not enabling questions. So for the attendees, if you want to post questions on the chat, I think this is the easiest way we have now to circumvent this technological issue, because as the Justice said, technology brought a lot of good things for us, but also brought some headaches sometimes, making our work a bit challenging. So if you want to post your questions on the chat, I'll be happy to read those. Otherwise, I'll probably open first to our other speakers. If you guys want to make any questions, is there anyone who wants to open the questions? If not, I'm happy to open the discussion with a question. No? Okay. So I'll open and then get the conversation going. Just as you talked about the need to moderate content on social media and the necessity of making sure that we have content that is truthful and that's not spreading disinformation, and thinking about regulating how we use the platforms, particularly in the context of populist regimes or authoritarian regimes. I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more your opinion on what the threats do potentially governments pose on their citizens and the human rights of their citizens and civil societies organizations through the use of that technology, and how can we protect ourselves or respond to that, and even maybe what is the role of the judiciary in that protection.
Okay. Fernanda, when we are talking about content moderation, we are basically talking about removal of content, removal of posts. We're talking about tagging, which is a warning about the dubious character of a certain post. We are talking about the use of algorithms to amplify or to reduce the scope of a certain message. We are talking about demonetization of sites. And so we are dealing with a great power that is given to the platforms to do this. So the balance that we need to strike here is between this necessary power, because there are contents that need to be removed, but we in the world, we got rid of state censorship, and we do not want to get into private censorship. So that's why I was talking about transparency and due process and fairness, so that freedom of expression is also protected. But of course, when we're talking about fundamental rights, we're talking about not allowing racism or white supremacy or pedophilia or inciting violence. So we need to balance many different interests here, from the platforms, from the government, from the users, and all of them involve human rights that we want to protect. So we want to protect freedom of expression, but we don't want people to be victims of racism. So there are human rights on all sides involved, and that's the difficulty here to strike, as I said, the proper balance. And as I mentioned before, like in Germany, if I'm not wrong, but I know this is being discussed in Europe in the Digital Services Act, that the platforms become liable once they are notified by the interested party that some posts should be removed. There's a danger involved there, because then you could have an over concern of the platform removing more things than it should, so that it won't be held liable. So I do prefer the system we use in Brazil, that you only remove, or you only are obliged to remove if there is a court order, except in a few cases that the law establishes, like revenge porn or some other things. So the difficulty here is that there are human rights involved in all sides of this discussion.
Thank you, Justice. I have a question from Caio and then Sarah. Caio, if you want to make your question.
Sure. Thank you, Justice Barroso, for your speech. Always very, very enriching. And I have to say, I do agree with everything you said. I would like to hear your opinions on a few issues, considering especially the Brazilian situation, which is very particular. Recent investigations have shown from the parliament have shown that this dissemination of disinformation is also largely promoted by high-ranking officials. So the first question is, I agree we need to look at the platforms, but I'm wondering, should officials be also free to make any use of social media, even if they're not, let's say, competent to speak of public health issues and or maybe frame public policy issues as a matter of opinion? And a second question also along those lines, if we have this epistemic crisis in Brazil, right? We have this parallel reality. What sort of legal instruments do we have to protect our tools of creating knowledge explicitly universities, scientific institutions, civil society organizations, or even public agencies, right? Such as environmental agencies and so on. Anyway, I'd be very grateful if you could also shed light a bit on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caio. Just for me to know, is this a public event? Like anyone could be watching this, Fernanda?
Yes, it's a public event. Yeah. Okay.
So just so kind of that I can measure my words properly. It's not just an academic space. So as you certainly know, and there is a book that describes this called Twilight of Democracy by a journalist called Anne Applebaum, and she describes how the conservative camp was, to a certain extent, captured by the far right, and how the far right started to use misinformation, hate, and conspiracy theories as a strategy to get to power and to stay in power. I'm talking about the world. I'm not talking about any specific country. But of course, there is a strategy of creating this alternative reality in which I project everything that I want to believe, and objective truth is something quite forgotten in this world. This happened in many parts, and it happened in Brazil, where there is, next to the office of the president, and that's public, I'm not judging, I'm just describing. There's this hate cabinet from where they disseminate information and news fighting their adversaries. This is very new, and just the acceptance of the use of the word, because they identify themselves as the hate cabinet, is a sign of the times. And of course, you have the right to be conservative, to be liberal, or to be progressive, but you do not have the right, especially if you are in public office, to disseminate false information and anti-scientific behavior that can kill people. So it's very delicate to deal with this. But as you might have heard, some posts by the president, just like happened to Trump, have been banned for disseminating false information and anti-scientific behavior. I would say, and I myself fought this fight against misinformation that tried to discredit the electoral system, and I'm the head of the electoral court, as you probably know. So the best way, I think, Caio, to deal with misinformation is to try to flood the market of ideas with proper information, with truthful information, and resist the temptation of doing the same thing. To cite Nietzsche, you should not become a monster when you fight monsters. So the debate in Brazil at a certain point became very uncivilized. If you become also uncivilized to fight people that behave like that, you lost the battle. So I would like to reiterate, and I hope I don't sound naive, because we won here a very difficult battle against the president and against many of his supporters that wanted to bring back paper vote. And we all feared that there was a huge fraud scheme behind that. And we fought fiercely to keep the electronic ballot system that we have. And the way I tried to lead this fight was not to use the same, let's say, poor vocabulary, and be as rational as possible in presenting the reasons why this system for Brazil is the best system that exists. So I do believe in true information, in good professional press, and monitoring the social media. What we did during the elections, in 2020 elections that I presided over, we entered partnerships with all social medias, or not all, but Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, TikTok, and Google. And they agreed to fight inauthentic behaviors, the robos, the trolls, the false profiles, and they did a very good job. And as for the content, we had a direct channel with them. So whenever we would find some kind of misinformation involving the court or the credibility of the system, we, besides the partnership with the social media, we had partnerships or a coalition with the fact-checking agencies. So we monitor the social media. We detected falsehood. We immediately would send it to the fact-checking agency. They would reestablish the truth, and we would get back to the social media, and they would either remove or tag the post as inaccurate or as false. And it was a lot of work, but it did work. So we don't have in Brazil and in most countries, we still don't have a law, a statute for the proper control of content in social media. So we had mostly to deal with, their self-regulation, and they enter in agreements. And one thing I want to mention before I close this answer is during the 2018 elections, I was vice president, and the technological platforms, they didn't want to talk much with us. They said, no, we're just, we're not censors, we're just the road through which information circulate. We don't want to, get involved in anything. And that brought them a damage to their image, because they were being used against democracy, as it happened in Brexit, in Hungary, in the US elections. So they've had a change of heart. They are more flexible to fighting improper content. The main problem remains, though, is that since hate and lies and sensationalism bring more engagement, they have the wrong incentives. And so I think they're still very tolerant with what they should not tolerate.
Thank you, Justice. I'm going to open the question for Veridiana. Veridiana, do you want to make, and probably this should be our last question to wrap it up.
Okay, thanks, Fernanda. Thank you, Justice Barroso, for your intervention and insights. I would like to also pose a question that is related to technology in larger context. So considering the scenario and concerns you described in your speech, how do you see the entanglement of technology with larger and social economic contexts? And what are the risks of solutions or alleged solutions that focus mainly on technologically driven responses, disregarding this larger picture, and also disregarding the historical challenges that we have in the region, in Brazil? I'm also based in Brazil, regarding freedom of expression and its core relation with privacy.
Well, one characteristic, Veridiana, of the world today is the unpredictability. It's so I I won't try to guess much of what the future brings. One thing that I can mention, though, during the 70s, when I was much younger and a bit more handsome, everyone was concerned with pornography. There was this major fear that pornography would reach the mainstream. And what happened is, with as time went by, pornography was confined to a specific ghetto where people that want to consume it will go, but it never reached the mainstream. I have the hope that with this kind of behavior in the internet, full of hate and misinformation, professional misinformation, that with the as time goes by, that this will also be confined to a corner of history. Of course, there will always be political polarization. It's unavoidable, and it has always existed. Since the American Constitution, you had the Republicans and the Federalists, or in the French and National Assembly, you had the left and the right. I came to age in the division between socialism and capitalism. The problem is not polarization. The problem is that social media gave voice and access to the public sphere, to everyone. So we need to, I think, increase the digital education of people and hope that we can improve behaviors. I rely more in self-regulation than in state intervention. I live in a country, I'm not sure if you were born here, in Fernanda, I know for sure that was. And the goals that haunted my generation was state intervention in freedom of expression and censorship. So we are all very scared of state intervention. But we are now becoming scared of misinformation and scared of private censorship. And in the case of Brazil, if anyone watched, there were major attacks by the far right trying to deconstruct and destroy institutions like Congress, like the Supreme Court. There was an actual mobilization of far right people that supported the president that wanted to shut down Congress and shut down the court. So we needed to react. So we are dealing here with very powerful conflicting interests that we need to manage. We don't want the state intervening too much, but we can't leave it all to the technological platforms because they don't have the right incentives. We don't want private censorship by the platforms, but we actually want them to remove content that's dangerous to democracy or because they're criminal. So it's hard to predict what's going to be on our plate in the future. But right now, I think we need a moderate control of content to protect democracy, to protect fundamental rights, including freedom of expression. It's not simple, and that's the reason why you see this debate going on in Europe, in Brazil, in the US, and we want to have these platforms free because free enterprise and free expression, but we don't want them to be over powerful, and we don't want to lose control to all algorithms that we don't know exactly what they're doing. So there's this concern of what can we do And I think transparency is the word here. I want to know what the algorithms are doing with my access to information. So there is a lot of ideas and concerns on the table right now, and we're all trying to sort out what's really important and what the proper balance is.
Thank you so much, Justice. Thank you for the questions, for your presentation. As Caio said, always enlightening and insightful. We are going to close this first part of the session. Justice told me that he has to attend to another event. So I'm gonna ask you to help me, salute the Justice and thank him for his participation. Thank you very much. We're gonna move on to our roundtable now. Our roundtable will have 4 participants who I will present in order of speech. So I will present the speaker. The speaker will speak for around 5 minutes. Then we will move on to the next speaker. And at the end, we will have 20 to 25 minutes of discussion so that we have a discussion that includes all of the talks rather than Q&A after each of the talks. So you can write down your questions. You can write them on the chat. If the Q&A button is not working, please write them down on the chat. Also, I remind the attendees that we're operating with 2 translation rooms, so Portuguese and Spanish. So you just have to click on the little globe on your screen and you will be able to access the Portuguese and the English buttons as well. And without further ado, we're going to start our roundtable with Dr. Carlos Solar. So Dr. Solar is a lecturer in sociology and a member of the Center of Criminology at the University of Essex in the United Kingdom, where he teaches and writes on democratic governance, criminology, and military studies. He previously was a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford, and he's author of Government and Governance of Security, and his forthcoming book is entitled Cybersecurity Governance and the Military in Latin America. So, Dr. Solar, please, you have the mic. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Fernanda, for the invitation. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Justice Barroso, for introducing such a lively conversation, which is so topical and timely to Latin America. I think the whole world is looking at what the new regions, the younger regions, are doing with the massive access to the internet, with all the people that is actually connecting to the internet via their phones at their homes, and I think Latin America is a huge part of that new movement. I would like to compliment a little bit on what you just said. I don't want to repeat anything that's been put on the table again. So I think I'm going to focus on 3 ideas. One is on the role of the military in terms of cybersecurity governance. I think that with that, it will be a segue to how Latin America sits in between China and the United States in certain themes of cybersecurity governance. And finally, speak a little bit more on what Sarah was mentioning about national security concerns within the region and where do public and private interests sit within the cybersecurity governance broad themes. So there are there's plenty of evidence that cybersecurity governance at the top of governments, it's been dealt by the military, actually. Without going too far, Brazil has a very complex network of actors that belong to the armed forces that actually take part of the cybersecurity governance, with cybersecurity headquarters, which is a big part of government in the defense sector in Brazil. Same happens in Chile, same happens in Argentina, in Mexico as well. For instance, Jim Mattis, who used to be the Secretary of Defense for Donald Trump, the only trip that he did back to Latin America in 2018, it was to like-minded countries, such as the ones that I've just mentioned, and he signed one agreement during the tour, and you can probably imagine that agreement was on cybersecurity. So there's knowledge and there is language that puts cybersecurity very close to what the military actually does. And for obvious reasons, the military is in charge of national security, just like Sarah was mentioning. The military has a telecommunications factor, which is part of the service branches. So a lot of engineers work in the military, and the military has budget to actually protect telecommunications. And of course, cybersecurity kind of like fits nicely with what the military does for the emerging democracies. Every time there is a problem, such as public security, and Brazil is another case of this, what do the elected authorities do? They probably call the military, they call generals, they're always there, they're ready to go out and so on. So there's a problem when you militarize something that is meant to be unmilitary, such as the internet, right? So Sarah was mentioning the problems of authoritarianism, and Justice Barroso as well, the problems of authoritarianism and populism, plus the internet, right? The internet is meant to the significance of the internet is about freedoms, about liberty. So it's the absolute opposite to what authoritarianism means. But as we know, authoritarians also use the internet to propagate their message, right? And the military, although the military in Latin America is not very prone to military coups anymore, speaking broadly, we know that they sit kind of like on the fence, right? So you know, probably President Bolsonaro came with the help of the military, but now his government kind of like hangs because of the military in power. So the military is this kind of like dynamic entity that can do a lot of things for government, but it can also do a lot of bad things for government. So in the book that I'm writing at the moment, I interviewed a lot of people from in and outside the defense sector. And some of them are very happy that cybersecurity governance now incorporates the military, right? Because the region is quite peaceful. So whenever there is a security challenge, the military likes to step in. And some of them are not that very convinced that they should do it, probably because all of what Mr. Barroso has just said, right? So there is a huge gray area in terms of human rights. There's a huge gray area in terms of regulation as well. And the military, what they want now is that they want to have corporate privileges like they had before. So they want to go out in the streets and help on public security if they know they won't be judged for any human rights abuses. So in cyberspace and in cybersecurity, they kind of like want to help, but they also want a legal framework that will protect them from whatever could happen on cyberspace that won't be on their favor. So that put us on the ham of the sandwich, right? So on top you have the United States, and below you have China. And this again is another conversation, because mostly what the developing countries in Latin America want to do is that they want to grow closer to China, and that's understandable. So China is offering 5G, is offering a bunch of public tenders are being won by Chinese interests. For instance, another anecdote, Chile has just put a public tender to fabricate passports, you know, the physical paper passport. And can you imagine who won the public tender? It won, a Chinese company won the public tender to create Chilean passports. So basically, and as you know, Chinese companies, they need to have an open back door for the government to go in and have access to probably most of their data. So obviously that raised the alarms, and anecdotes like this are plenty. There is a telephone company, a massive telephone factory in the south of Argentina that also belongs to China. China wants to put 5G in Latin America and so on. So if we look at it from a developmental side of things, us getting closer, us Latin Americans getting closer to China is a good thing. But then you forget that Jim Mattis was actually signing agreements with the authorities on the defense sector saying, you should probably stay away from China as much as you can when it comes to telecommunications and the internet. Okay, so the president kind of like sits in the middle. One day he listens to his or her defense minister will say, we don't want to do anything on security with China, but the next day they meet the economic ministers, and the economic minister will actually go and say, we have a huge multi-million deal on development with China. So there is a conversation there that it doesn't have a clear understanding in terms of what Latin American governments will do with this polarization of cybersecurity governance between East and West. And then finally, if we go to a lower level of cybersecurity governance with public interest and private interest, of course, the macro will be to talk about the public interest as something that governments should probably protect, right? So pretty much all the ideas, as Justice Barroso has just said, people going into platforms and not dealing with their data and so on. But the private interests are quite funny, because private interests, they want to maximize utilities. And how do you maximize utilities? By having more users, by collecting more data, and probably by circumventing the law in some way that is still legal, but it creates enough power for a big private interest to gain access to people's data. Because at the end of the day, we want to know how the consumer will react. So we want to know more about their data. So again, governments are pretty much, they need to invest on private interests. Of course, they need to give a solid economic market platform for private interests to grow. That's what countries want, especially the emerging countries in Latin America with big markets such as Brazil, of course. But they also want to keep the public happy, and they want to know that Facebook is not actually reading all your emails and Gmail is not selling your data. So it opens up an entire new conversation on how law will protect the individual in these countries, especially now that the emerging democracies want to have a big step forward in terms of development. So when you mix all three ideas that I've just mentioned, right? So the military being on top of cybersecurity governance and kind of like being on the ear of the president, China and the United States both clashing in terms of who gets the biggest portion of Latin America, right? And then how to protect the individual, the public individual, big versus the big private companies. Of course, that the Latin American countries look abroad, and they look at how the UK and well, the UK post-Brexit and the European Union have done related to this. But I must say that countries in Latin America do look up to the United States. So a big conversation within Latin American cybersecurity should be, how are we incorporating ideas from the United States into our natural language or legal language and our governance language, which sometimes it's not the same, right? For lawyers to put out a law, but actually that law to be implemented, there's a big gap in terms of public policy. So although I think I've run over time, I think it's plenty enough of ideas to have a lively conversation afterwards. Thank you, Fernanda.
Thank you, Dr. Solar. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have a little bit of time in the Q&A to discuss further those ideas that were really insightful, very, very interesting. Thank you so much for your speech. So following on, we will have Veridiana Alimonti. Veridiana is a Latin American senior policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She's a lawyer, holds a master's degrees in economic law from the University of São Paulo, and is currently a PhD researcher in human rights at the same institution. Her work focuses on the intersection of technology and human rights, such as privacy and freedom of expression. Before joining EFF, Veridiana was a study visitor at the Data Protection Unit at the Council of Europe. She has worked in Brazilian civil organizations such as IDEC and Intervozes, and was one of the civil society's representatives at the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee between 2010 and 2013. Thank you very much, Veridiana, for agreeing to participate of our debate. You have the mic.
Thank you, Fernanda, and thanks also to thank Rights and Security International for the invitation. So I work at EFF, which is a nonprofit organization defending human and fundamental rights in the digital world through different activities, impact litigation, policy analysis, grassroots activism, and technology development. And well, considering our conversation so far and also Sarah's initial lines, I would like to highlight and emphasize the track record of government abuse of surveillance technologies in Latin America. deepened and reinforced by a culture of secrecy regarding the deployment, acquisition, and use of surveillance technologies. EFF and other organizations have been for many years reaffirming the need for the compliance with human rights international standards in communication surveillance based on clear, specific, and transparent laws, necessary and proportionate measures directed to a legitimate end in a democratic society with proper public oversight and strong due process safeguards. These are part of the necessary and proportionate principles and other initiatives regarding reinforcing that this whole package have to be ensured. And however, what we constantly see is the harassment to marginalized communities, such the Mapuche indigenous community in Chile, several scandals of unlawful communications interception, like in Colombia, the existence of government legal intelligence centers targeting political adversaries, as reported revealed in Mexico last year, the acquisition and government use of malicious software across the region without even having laws authorizing the use of those, and despite the international concerns around how these technologies are frequently abused, as the Pegasus case recently blasted in the news with a relevant focus on Mexico. Although many countries in the region already have or are carrying out processes to approve data protection legislations with greater safeguards in terms of transparency, minimization, and proportionality, for example, many of those frameworks don't directly apply to intelligence activities and criminal investigations. Those most affected by such abuses are vulnerable communities, human rights defenders, journalists, dissidents. What leaves explicit how this negatively impacts the ability to build and preserve strong democratic societies in the region. In this sense, I would like to emphasize end-to-end encrypted tools as key technologies, enabling the enjoyment of free expression, privacy, and other fundamental rights. For a while now, we have been stressing how the antagonism between encryption and security is a false antagonism. Most recently, we've been facing similar claims regarding encryption and democracy. Due to dissemination of disinformation in end-to-end encrypted applications with a focus on WhatsApp, considering the high number of users the application has. So right now, we are under a real risk of approving a traceability mandate in encrypted messaging applications in Brazil, seeking to break the end-to-end encryption principle that protects the confidentiality of the content of communications even before the communications intermediaries, based on problematic assumptions that knowing the originator of a content communication chain coincides with identifying the author of this content, which is not true. This will most likely lead to massive data retention of millions of innocent users, the inversion of the burden of proof, disincentivize the deployment of secure technologies for a measure that does not even have its efficacy demonstrated. Another concerning trend to point out in the region is the persecution of security experts and developers of security tools who have unfortunately been the subject of the same types of harassment as those they work to protect, such as human rights defenders and activists. One case to highlight in this sense is the criminal prosecution of the free software developer Olabini in Ecuador, fraught with due process violations and even trying to criminalize the use of secure communication tools, such as Tor, used as evidence against him in court. Seeking to address some of these issues, a group of organizations, Karisma as well, and EFF, has recently launched the Alliance for Encryption in Latin American and Caribbean, ACLAC, if you want to know more. And to conclude, I would like to emphasize that the protection and promotion of security, rights, and democracy in the region depends on the respect of necessary and proportionate human rights standards to communication surveillance and the ability for us all to communicate and organize securely. And this is even more crucial within contexts marked by the rise of authoritarianism. This would be my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Veridiana. Thank you so much, and thank you for maintaining to the short time. I'm sure we'll have opportunity to expand this a little bit further in our discussion. Okay, so the third speaker today is Carolina Botero. So Carolina is the executive director of the Colombian civil society digital rights organization Karisma Foundation. She is a researcher, lawyer, lecturer, writer, and consultant on topics related to law and technology. Carolina works for a world where human rights and social justice guide the development and deployment of technology. Carolina holds a master's degree in international law and cooperation from VUB Belgium and a master's degree in business and contracting law from UAB Spain. Carolina, thank you so much for agreeing to participate, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this important webinar. I tried to use the event background, but I look like the evil image of myself. So I ended up preventing from using it, and here I am with my house. And so let me start by saying that the analysis of online human rights violation is important to understand the new threats to fundamental freedoms and rights in our society, something that we do from Karisma Foundation, the organization I work for in Colombia. From this point of view, I will speak, let's say, from Latin America, but I will focus on Colombia as it is my place of expertise. First of all, I would like to confirm that our history in Latin America with authoritarianism explains how the state power addresses citizens in our societies. They are often called terrorists or vandals. In our countries, they are state enemies. That because the state enemies does not come from the outside, but they come from within. And this pattern still holds today, can be seen in the security and also in the cybersecurity agendas. I would like to focus on the social protest landscape of the last couple of years. As already I believe it was the Justice remind us in 2019, we witnessed an uprising of social unrest in the region. People from Chile, Puerto Rico, Ecuador, Colombia, they protest. They started a long list of etc. countries in the region that were claiming their rights and were abruptly silenced by the pandemic. Let me focus now on Colombia, because in Colombia, the people returned to the streets at the end of 2020, 1 year ago, and again in March, April 2021. However, in this moment, the protests were not just in the street. What we saw was the new challenge that the pandemic brought. This is a very speed digitization that include all human activities, also the protest. Political, social movements, civil society organizations, journalists, people were all of them using the tools at their disposal that had the power to directly communicate them and their contents and make them viral. So no doubt, the internet is a space that encourages and spurs the exercise of protests, whether through chain letters, online petitions, demonstrations, or campaigns in social media. The networks allow the full and democratic exercise of freedom of expression and information, the right to associate, and the participation in political life. And that was true in the protest. I would need to also remind that in our countries, 50% of the people live without internet connections. So this is nothing that I'm saying it's general or applies to everyone. But of course, those that are connected found, and because these protests were really very much urban, they found themselves with a strong tool that they were using. Under these circumstances, what is mandate for the state is to guarantee the access to the internet for citizens, to guarantee that there are conditions and that there will be no intimidation, stigmatization, or violation for people who protest on the web. However, and this is not said only by me, but by the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, for instance. But what happened is that faced with this new expression of digital political participation, the Colombian state continued with the textbook response, that is, stigmatize, criminalize, and persecute. This is what happened during the protests that occurred in Colombia this year. During the last decades, Colombia has acquired and deployed surveillance technologies such as software for monitoring political opponents, but journalists or human rights defenders. They are also using technologies for aggregating, such as open data for intelligence. And during April and June, we saw all of these technology used against citizens that were protesting. At Karisma, we produced a report called Guns Against Cell Phones that will soon be available in English, but it's now only in Spanish, where we describe this at more length. I will do a very short summary on some specific issues. I would like to highlight or point that the legal framework that the state used to do this during the last protest was something called cyber patrolling. Law enforcement had produced a legal framework, a very weak legal framework, because it appeared in a resolution in 2015 by the Ministry of Defense, saying that this was needed to reply to the cyber threats. And this is not a law, it's a resolution. So we start here with the problems in the framework of human rights. But under the sake of this being something that is in the legal framework of Colombia, we didn't know exactly what it was. There was no recall on the activities or controls on what does this mean. By the protest in June 2021, when the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights visit Colombia because of the protests, the Ministry of Defense produced a report, and it pointed out that there are 3 different elements under the cyber patrolling umbrella. They are fighting against cyber threats, they are using profiling, and they are fighting against fake news. So these 3 things also can be seen from a security perspective, because the main justification is security, is there are vandals and terrorists in the streets, and we need to protect the people. What we can see here is a very troubling trend that I believe is common to the region. And I will point out to three main things, and some of them are being built upon something I've already heard from Rafael Zanata and other activists in the region. The first one is that there is an expansion of service security issues with a strong militarization perspective that shifts, in this case, the protests about people protecting freedoms and avoiding discrimination to topics of sovereignty and national security. And in this case, probably they will not say national security, but they will mention public security. Second, there is a troubling narrative that labels many protest contents and people as of inciting violence. And it comes with criminalization. The government has even, and this is said in the report by the Ministry of Defense, pressure or ask technology companies to enforce human rights standards and remove such content because it has to do with extreme violence content that violates rights. And this is a subversion of the logic that we must refrain from. Third, there is a worrisome trend to control the narrative where the state is the one, and not just the state, law enforcement is the one that defines what is true and what is not in the public space of internet, expands terrorist concepts and amplifies criminal concepts too. So I would just like to finish my intervention by saying that in Latin America, for us Latin American activists, we need to follow these trends. We need to find ways to protect the civic space as a place to exercise rights, and not just in the physical space, but also in the digital space. We need to bring to this space the guarantees and controls that exist and that we have built in decades or centuries for the physical space. And also, we need to continue to promote debates on how to invest in real people concerns around security, and and try to prevent us from continue this trend of security as the one derived from the sovereignty of the state and the national security. I will leave it there. Thank you very much. Fernanda.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Thank you very much for very interesting thoughts, and which we can, of course, continue discussing in the Q&A. So for our final panelist, last but not least, we have Caio Machado. So Caio studies disinformation in Brazil. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford Center for Social Legal Studies, researching anti-scientific discourse during the COVID-19 pandemic in Brazil. He is also the co-founder of Instituto Vero, where he researches disinformation. He holds a master in social science from the University of Oxford as well, and a master in digital law from the Sorbonne. Caio, thank you so much for agreeing to participate in our discussion, for your questions before, and please, the mic is yours.
Fernanda, thank you very much for the invite. I thank also the RSI for having me in this amazing event. So I believe a lot of what I intended to say has been covered by Justice Barroso and Veridiana just recently. I think we share a lot of the same worries, concerns regarding the current situation, at least in my case in Brazil, which is where I'm specializing. So I'd like to shed light on a few issues related to combating disinformation. And I think that the current scenario, we have a very limited toolkit, legally speaking, to handle disinformation, or at least we have tried to handle it using the wrong tools. Brazil has this history of trying to deal with internet problems through criminalization. When we finally approved in 2014 what was translated in English as the Internet Bill of Rights, this was a huge success because for the first time we approved the legislation that looked at the internet as a space for exercising liberties instead of trying to create crimes for all sorts of conducts and activities online. Similarly, when we approved the data protection law a couple of years ago, this was a great advance because we're also looking at creating rights and regulating from a standpoint of ensuring liberties other than trying to hit people with the axe or the bat of regulation. So right now, Brazil is really stuck in trying to handle disinformation through two main angles. One, as I've mentioned, punishing people criminally. The other one is through content moderation, which is a very technocentric solution. It's the idea that, you know, the roads or the companies we're using have to somehow solve issues that are highly political. And I think that we need to step back. These tools are valid and they do have an important role, but I think we need to step back and try to understand a bit better what is the phenomenon we're trying to handle. If we look at a parliamentary investigation that occurred in 2019, looking specifically at fake news, well, it was called the fake news investigations, but the object of these investigations ranged from attacks to the election and election interference, cyberbullying, and instigating children to commit crimes and suicide. So I think there is this cultural concern on what is going on the internet and how to control this. And we just try to fit it in the most, let's say, grave and severe punishments possible. And obviously, all of these are issues. But when we try to create something new and punish a new form of conduct, we need to apply a big effort in trying to understand what is actually going on. And I think mixing, let's say, suicide, you know, or cyberbullying, or even internet pornography and so on, with disinformation, it probably means that we haven't dialed exactly our definitions to properly address the situation. So a few things that have been tried. Passing an internet bill, a fake news bill, which Veridiana commented, one of the main issues, which is creating these mass surveillance mechanisms for traceability and other issues but this is probably the worst one. Using the national security law, which is very concerning, and now it has been revoked, but in revoking it, we approved a law against mass deceptive communication, which is the modern version of the national security law, right? If in the 70s we'd use national security to hunt down communists and defend political narratives, now mass deceptive communication might be the brand new tool to try to fight political narratives going on online. So I think we can break the issue into smaller bits and understand that maybe if we can't resolve the issue of disinformation, maybe there are some behaviors that we can control. Right now in Brazil, and the minister, Justice Barroso can say this, but I can. I'm not a judge. The main source of disinformation in the country is the president, and ministers, health ministers, and so on. And content moderation will not solve this. He's doing it out in the open. It's not some sketchy platform, Getter, encrypted, whatever. It's out in the open, and we have an underlying political crisis that is, why can't we do anything about it? Why do we have evidence, scientific evidence, countering what is being stated, countering this public health policy that is being rolled out through media declaration, tweets, and so on, and we cannot punish this individual? And I think that points to the fact that we're trying to handle disinformation through technology, and it is a facet. I'm not trying to deny that. I absolutely agree with what Justice Barroso said, but I think we have some deeper issues that we need to grapple with. And I can give a little bit of my opinion as I finish my speech, which is maybe we need to think about limits and boundaries on how public servants and public officials use social media platforms. Maybe they shouldn't be treated as personal environments, especially if they're using social media in the exercise of their public roles. Similarly, maybe we need to have better legal protection of certain mechanisms of producing evidence, such as scientific institutions. And finally, I think we have a very serious issue in Brazil of separating what is public and what is private communication. And we're trying to attribute public or private communication based on what platform people are using. And obviously, these two spheres entail levels of protection that are very different. And if we try to say, well, Twitter is public communication, therefore we're going to do the Twitter law, we're bound to do something wrong because Twitter is going to change. We don't know if Twitter is going to be around tomorrow. So I think we need to look more at the principles and what we're trying to protect instead of trying to ad hoc fit in, into existing legislation, punish criminally, and create new crimes. Try to condense my opinion into something very, very short.
Thank you. Yes, and as you can see, we've had so many fascinating ideas and really educational insights here that we have unfortunately run out of time. So I apologize to everyone that we're not going to have the Q&A that we had hoped to have, but I'm going to turn over to Fernanda in a moment. But from me as well, thank you so much to all our speakers and also to the interpreters who have worked hard. And that's also why, unfortunately, we'll need to end now because I know that interpreting is hard work. But once again, thank you so much from me and from RSI. Fernanda, I'll let you close us out. But thank you for our speakers. And again, we'll have to have another event like this where we can have more of an exchange. So that's something we'll take forward for the future.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for all of the speakers. Yeah, I'm sorry that we have to cut this short due to our limitations of interpretations and technology, etc. But I'm sure this leaves room to say that there's so much more that we need to discuss on these topics and so many others. As we said, this is a series of webinars that will happen regularly, and we invite all of the organizations that are either here as attendees or that will watch us on YouTube to get in touch, to get to know the Rights Coalition a bit better, to be part of this, bigger movement so that we can continue these conversations and continue strengthening our work further to the future. I thank so much the speakers who are here, the participants. I really look forward to our next conversations, and thank you very much, everyone, for being a part of this.
And special thanks to the interpreters as well. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you,
you.
Sarah. Nice to
Bye.
meet everyone else. Bye.